Welcome back, everyone. Before we dive in, make sure you drop your thoughts and the lessons you took from this story in the comments. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Sometimes the deepest betrayal is not being cheated out of money. It is discovering how little the person you loved truly respected you. When someone starts measuring your worth by status, success, or what they think you can provide, love can quietly turn into contempt. And sometimes the truth they refuse to see becomes the very thing that changes everything. My name is Nathaniel Hayes, and I am 43 years old. The morning my marriage finally broke open in court, my wife, Tamara, sat under oath and explained what she believed I had contributed during our 8 years together. Nothing, she said. I carry the household. I paid the mortgage, the cars, the vacations. Nathaniel had opinions about business, but opinions are not income. I spent years supporting a man who wanted the lifestyle of a successful person without doing the work. Her attorney asked whether she considered me financially dependent on her. Tamara did not hesitate. Yes, she replied. I loved him once, but somewhere along the way I realized I had married someone comfortable living behind me. There were restrained murmurs from the gallery before Judge Denise Holloway looked over her glasses and restored complete silence. I sat beside my attorney, Victor Cross, without reacting. Tamara had called me worse outside the courtroom. What hurt was not the insult itself. It was knowing how many years I had spent quietly helping the woman who now believed I had been standing in her shadow. Years earlier, before contempt replaced affection, Tamara had been the person whose ambition I admired most. When we met at a charity dinner in Chicago, she was 32 and working 18-hour days at Riverton Development Group, a real estate and infrastructure company struggling to establish itself against larger competitors. She was intelligent, disciplined, and almost painfully determined to prove she belonged in every room she entered. Our early evenings together rarely involved expensive restaurants. More often, she brought work home and spread contracts across my kitchen table in Winnetka. I would make dinner while she read proposals aloud. She thought I was an independent financial consultant. That was partly true. I understood finance extremely well. What she did not know was why. One night, 6 months into our relationship, she pushed a financing memorandum toward me and said, "Tell me whether this makes sense." I spotted an unfavorable refinancing trigger her team had missed. She stared at the paragraph, then at me. "How did you see that?" she asked. I read slowly. I replied. She laughed and kissed my cheek. Back then, she appreciated what I noticed. I supported her in hundreds of quiet ways after that. When a regional acquisition nearly collapsed because of an environmental indemnity clause, I helped her restructure the offer before her legal department reopened negotiations. When a senior executive attempted to hide questionable expense reimbursements inside project costs, I noticed a pattern in the numbers and encouraged Tamara to request an internal audit. She did, and the company avoided a scandal months before an outside auditor would have discovered it. During one particularly difficult winter, when 2 lenders withdrew from a project within the same week, Tamara sat on our bedroom floor at 2 in the morning and told me she was afraid she was not good enough for the position she had fought to earn. I sat beside her until sunrise. One failed financing package does not erase everything you know, I told her. Go back tomorrow and solve the next problem. She did. I never considered those nights sacrifices. I thought that was marriage, remembering someone's strength when they temporarily forgot it themselves. What Tamara did not know was that my financial life had been built long before we met. 12 years before our wedding, I founded Harrison Cress Capital Group after acquiring and restructuring a failing logistics company outside Cleveland, Ohio. Over the next decade, Harrison Cress became a large private investment organization with holdings in logistics, technology, manufacturing, infrastructure, and commercial property. I was wealthy, but I was not invisible. My ownership was documented with banks, regulators, auditors, counterparties, trustees, tax authorities, and our board. It simply was not widely publicized. After watching public attention damage my father's relationships, I structured my affairs so Harrison Cress management team dealt with the public while I remained away from cameras whenever possible. My parents had divorced when I was 12. My father eventually became very wealthy. My mother, Evelyn, kept the Oak Park house she loved and continued teaching English in public school because she valued her classroom more than expensive addresses. Watching the two of them taught me that money could enlarge a life, but could also distort every relationship around it. Before Tamara and I married, Victor insisted on a prenuptial agreement. Most of my premarital holdings were already inside the Hayes Legacy Trust, including the Caldwell Drive house in Winnetka, which a trust-owned property company had purchased 3 years before I met Tamara. Our agreement kept premarital trust assets separate and allowed both of us to maintain independent finances. We filed separate tax returns, used professional accountants, and kept personal investment accounts apart. We also maintained one joint household account into which we both deposited agreed amounts. Tamara knew I had family investments and consulting income. She did not know the scale because I never gave her a reason to think scale mattered. She never asked for my tax returns, and under our agreement, neither of us was required to surrender private business records unless a legal or lending need arose. I did not create that arrangement as a test. I had structured my life that way before meeting her. Tamara had her career. I had mine. I believed privacy and dishonesty were different things. Eventually, our divorce taught me how complicated that distinction could become. Harrison Crest began investing in Riverton 2 years after Tamara and I married, but I never secretly directed money into her company from my personal desk. That would have been reckless. I disclosed the marriage to Harrison Crest's Independent Investment Committee, recused myself from votes involving Riverton, and let the committee evaluate every transaction on commercial terms. Riverton's board knew Harrison Crest was a major institutional investor. Tamara regularly dealt with our managing directors and legal team. What she did not know was that I controlled Harrison Crest. I requested that the investment team never use my relationship with her to influence decisions. The arrangement benefited both companies, and every transaction was documented. Over 6 years, Harrison Crest invested approximately $1.4 billion through 19 separate transactions. 3 of those investments arrived during periods when Riverton faced serious liquidity problems. Tamara knew the investments existed. She simply believed they came from an institution run by people she had never personally met. I remained silent because I wanted her accomplishments judged on the work she actually did, not dismissed as favors from her husband. The investment that mattered most came during the Harrove acquisition, the achievement Tamara later described as the deal that made her career. Riverton had spent 14 months pursuing Harrove infrastructure, but 2 weeks before closing, a lender withdrew after a regulatory delay increased the risk. Without replacement capital, Riverton would lose the acquisition, a substantial deposit, and possibly violate covenants on another credit facility. Harrison Crest Committee supported the investment, but the amount exceeded its normal delegated authority and required my approval as controlling shareholder after my conflict was formally documented. I authorized a $185 million bridge commitment and immediately recused myself from everything that followed. The acquisition closed. Tamara received public praise for saving it. 6 months later, she was promoted. On the evening the promotion was announced, she came home holding champagne and said, "I finally proved I can carry something this big." I kissed her and said, "You did." I never told her about my signature. I wanted her to remember the victory as hers because the strategy, negotiations, and months of work genuinely had been hers. The distance between us began gradually after Warren Vale became chairman of Riverton's parent holding company. Warren was 50, polished, socially connected, and extremely comfortable reminding people of his influence. Tamara started mentioning him at dinner. First it was harmless. "Warren thinks I should be running a larger division," she told me. Then it became comparison. "Warren says people on my level need spouses who understand visibility." Later she stopped asking what I thought about work altogether. At industry events, she introduced me as Nathaniel, my husband, then immediately changed the subject when someone asked what I did. Once, driving home from a fundraiser, she said, It is difficult explaining your career to people. I looked at her. You could tell them I work in private investment consulting, I said. That sounds vague, she replied. Everything about what you do sounds vague. I asked whether that embarrassed her. She watched the road for several seconds before saying, sometimes. That answer stayed with me longer than I admitted. Warren's involvement stopped feeling professional before Tamara ever filed for divorce. I noticed calendar entries marked as executive dinners on evenings when other Riverton executives later mentioned having been elsewhere. Hotel charges appeared on a credit card Tamara used for business reimbursements, including one overnight stay at a downtown Chicago hotel on a night she told me she was attending a late board strategy session. I did not accuse her. Instead, I asked whether something was happening between us that she was afraid to say aloud. You are becoming suspicious because you have too much time, she replied. Months later, during discovery, Victor obtained records from Riverton's internal investigation that answered the question. Tamara and Warren had exchanged hundreds of private messages. They discussed dinners they concealed from colleagues. They talked about traveling together after my divorce was final. One message from Warren read, "You deserve a life that matches what you built." Tamara replied, "I am tired of walking into rooms and having to explain the man beside me." The exchange that hurt most came 3 weeks before she filed. Warren had written, "You still sound guilty when you talk about leaving him." Tamara replied, "Guilty is not the word. I feel responsible for him." Nathaniel became comfortable being small because I became successful enough for both of us. Warren answered, "Then stop carrying someone who has chosen not to grow." Tamara wrote, "That is what I'm finally doing." I read those messages months later in Victor's office. I did not shout. I did not break anything. I closed the folder and sat there with my hands resting on the table. I remember the night of the Harrove closing when Tamara had fallen asleep against my shoulder after 40 hours without rest. I remembered signing the authorization that kept the deal alive. She had privately described me as a man comfortable being small while building her identity around an achievement my company had quietly helped rescue. Victor asked whether I wanted a moment. "No," I said. My voice sounded normal. That almost made it worse. The divorce papers arrived on a Tuesday morning. Tamara had already left for Riverton's Chicago headquarters when the courier reached Caldwell Drive. The petition accused me of concealing income, contributing little to the household, and using Tamara's earnings to maintain a lifestyle I could not support myself. Her attorneys argued that the Hayes Legacy Trust had been commingled with marital funds and that several joint investment accounts should therefore be classified largely in her favor. They also sought an interest in the Caldwell property despite the prenuptial agreement, alleging that years of marital payments had transformed the property. Victor called that afternoon. "Warren's consulting firm is paying a substantial portion of her legal expenses through a disclosed third-party funding agreement," he said. More importantly, one of Harrison Crest's portfolio companies noticed information requests that have nothing to do with property division. Someone is using discovery to identify confidential holdings and lender relationships. Warren could not stage a hostile takeover of Harrison Crest because it was private. What he could do was obtain confidential information useful in competing acquisitions, pressure portfolio companies, and exploit. Financing relationships. I drove to Tamara's office that evening with an envelope containing the Caldwell title record, the relevant section of our prenuptial agreement, and a plain-language explanation of the trust-owned property company that had funded the house. She met me in the lobby. "Read this before your attorneys turn a divorce into something neither of us can control," I said. Tamara looked at the envelope but did not open it. "My lawyers have documents," she replied. "They have Warren's accountants, too." "Warren does not belong inside our marriage," I said. Her expression hardened. "Warren understands the financial world I actually live in." She tore the envelope once through the middle and handed it back. "I am done letting you confuse me with explanations nobody can verify." I picked up the pieces. "You could verify every page," I said. "You just have to read it." She walked toward the elevator. I watched the doors close, then called Victor. "Document that I tried to provide voluntary clarification," I said. "And from now on, everything goes through counsel." At our first mediation, Tamara's lead attorney, Malcolm, No, that name cannot be used. Her lead attorney, Roland Pierce, presented a far more careful version of what Tamara later told the press. He argued that she had paid most visible household expenses and believed the trust reimbursements were simply consulting income belonging to me. Victor responded with a prenuptial agreement and produced the Caldwell ownership records, which had already been disclosed. Roland understood immediately that the house claim was weak. Tamara did not. When he quietly tried to explain that title and tracing evidence could matter, she interrupted him. "We're not giving him $28 million because he found paperwork," she said. Victor looked at me, but said nothing. Then Tamara leaned across the table. "Sign over the disputed accounts, withdraw any personal claim connected to Riverton, and stop fighting the house. If you force this into court, I will stop protecting your reputation." "From what?" I asked. "From the truth about who supported whom," she replied. By then, Harrison Crest's investment monitoring team had found another problem. Riverton had transferred unusual consulting and acquisition preparation fees to 3 entities connected through the same corporate services provider. 2 payments involved projects Warren personally supervised. Because Harrison Crest was a major investor, our compliance group already had authority to review the transactions. I did not direct the investigation, but Victor received its preliminary findings through counsel. I called Tamara once and left a message. "There are transfers inside Riverton you need to have your audit committee review independently of Warren," I said. "Please do not ask Warren whether they are legitimate. Ask your audit committee." She never returned the call. I sent the warning again by email, attaching no confidential Harrison Crest material, but identifying the payment dates. Tamara forwarded my email to Warren within 20 minutes. Her message read, "He is trying to frighten me again." Warren replied, "He knows the case is tightening around him. Ignore it." Tamara did exactly that. The press campaign started the following week. A lifestyle publication described me as an unemployed husband who had spent years living on a successful executive's income. Other outlets repeated the framing. Tamara agreed to an interview from Riverton's conference room. Before the interview, Roland Pierce emailed her that household tracing was incomplete and specifically warned her not to state as fact that every major asset had been purchased with her personal earnings. Tamara replied, "I understand." Then she went on camera and said, "I paid for our life. The mortgage, the cars, the vacations, everything. Nathaniel contributed ideas when it suited him, but ideas did not pay our bills." That was the moment she became more than someone Warren had manipulated. She had received a direct warning from her own lawyer that the financial claim had not been verified. She chose to make it anyway. Internal messages later showed that Warren encouraged the interview, but Tamara approved the talking point herself and requested that Riverton's communications staff circulate the clip. The financial truth was less dramatic than Tamara's accusation and more complicated. During our marriage, our household manager paid recurring expenses from the joint account because that was the simplest administrative system. Tamara deposited income into the account. So did I. When Caldwell expenses were paid, the trust-owned property company transferred reimbursements into the account according to a standing agreement created before our marriage and disclosed to our accountants. No unreimbursed marital money ultimately financed the house. Tamara rarely reviewed the household ledger because she had delegated it, and I had never insisted she learn which transfer corresponded to which trust expense. That was one place where my preference for privacy had created avoidable confusion. But confusion did not explain everything she later said. Before signing her sworn asset declaration, Roland again told her the records did not support an absolute claim that her income created the property or every disputed account. Tamara signed anyway, stating that she believed substantially all disputed assets derived from her earnings and that I had no significant independent source of wealth. Her statement was not entirely false. She had earned substantial money during our marriage, and some joint savings legitimately came from both of us. But several material assertions were knowingly overstated. She had already been shown title records. She had already been told tracing remained unresolved. She knew Harrison Crest had made enormous investments into Riverton, although she did not know my relationship to it. She also authorized her attorneys to continue alleging that I had manufactured the trust structure after our marriage, even after the recorded purchase date, to disprove that claim. Roland pushed back in writing. Tamara's response was simple. Warren's team says the entities are alter egos. Proceed. Later, when that email entered the record, she could not say nobody had warned her. Warren had encouraged her certainty, but he had not held her hand over the signature line. She made choices because those choices supported the version of me she had already decided was true. A temporary account restriction entered the case. After Tamara alleged that I had begun moving marital funds offshore, the order did not freeze my entire fortune. It limited transfers from several specifically disputed accounts while forensic review proceeded. I stayed with my mother in Oak Park during part of that period, not because I lacked somewhere else to live, but because reporters had begun appearing near Caldwell Drive, and I wanted distance from the spectacle. My childhood bedroom had changed very little. Evelyn had replaced the curtains, but the same oak tree stood beyond the window. When photographers appeared outside her house one afternoon, she opened the door before I could stop her. "My son is a good man," she told them. "The paperwork will eventually be less interesting than the truth." Then she went back inside. That night, I apologized for bringing attention to her home. "Nathaniel," she said, "I taught 8th grade for 31 years. A reporter asking rude questions is not an emergency. Handle what is actually yours to handle." The real emergency was Warren. Harrison Crest's forensic team found evidence that the suspicious Riverton payments were part of one coherent scheme. Warren was diverting money through acquisition consulting entities while collecting confidential information about Harrison Crest's portfolio and lending relationships. He intended to use the information to advantage a competing investment consortium and cover his diverted payments by blaming irregular transfers on me during the divorce. The false offshore records were not a separate scheme. They were designed to make legitimate trust transfers look suspicious, reinforce Tamara's asset concealment allegations, and create enough confusion to pressure Harrison Crest into disclosing sensitive internal records. Tamara did not design any of that. But when Warren suggested that selected accusations be leaked to reporters, she approved it. When Roland warned that the offshore evidence had not been independently authenticated, Tamara allowed the allegation to remain in a filing until the court ordered verification. Warren was using her anger. She was also using his certainty because it told her exactly what she wanted to believe about me. Victor's team had another lead. 2 months earlier, an anonymous source had contacted them claiming someone working for Warren had commissioned fabricated transaction records. The source provided just enough technical detail to be credible, then disappeared. His name was Bryce Marsh, a 26-year-old software engineer who had been hired through a third-party data firm. Victor's investigators had been trying to authenticate him long before trial. When they finally located him, Bryce was terrified. He had created altered database exports and transaction summaries after being told they were test documents for litigation modeling. Later, he realized the files were being represented as genuine. He had preserved emails, payment records, source files, and recorded instructions. He also had messages discussing a courier who removed an authenticated forensic drive from Victor's secondary office after a temporary contractor's building credentials were compromised. The drive was not our only evidence, but it contained original metadata that would have made authentication faster. Victor reported the theft, preserved access logs, notified the court, and turned the security evidence over to law enforcement. Federal investigators were already examining Warren's interstate transfers and possible obstruction by the time Bryce agreed to cooperate. Victor could not promise government witness protection, and he did not pretend otherwise. He arranged private security, sought a protective order limiting unnecessary disclosure of Bryce's location, and connected him with federal investigators and his own independent attorney. Meanwhile, our forensic accountants rebuilt the disputed transaction history from banks, board records, custodians, audit work papers, and counterparties. 3 days before trial, Victor told me the evidentiary record was strong enough to expose everything. "Once we identify your ownership publicly, there is no restoring the privacy you had," he said. I know, I replied. My reason for delaying disclosure was no longer personal. Federal investigators had asked us not to alert Warren while they traced his entities and secured witnesses. Now that work was complete. Victor served Tamara's counsel with a supplemental disclosure package under seal, including authenticated Harrison Crest ownership records. Roland requested an emergency meeting with Tamara. She attended for 20 minutes, then left after telling him Warren believed the records were manufactured. Trial opened in the Domestic Relations Division of the Circuit Court of Cook County. Because the case had attracted significant attention, the judge limited courtroom seating and prohibited disruptive behavior. Reporters filled several permitted seats while cameras remained outside. Warren sat in the back beside one of his attorneys. Tamara sat across from me with Roland and 2 members of her legal team. Victor leaned toward me before proceedings began. Her attorneys know the ownership documents are authenticated, he whispered. Whether she accepts that is another matter. I nodded. That distinction mattered. The trial was not an ambush. The evidence had been produced. Her lawyers had reviewed it. Tamara had simply spent so long assuming every document supporting me must be deceptive that even her own counsel could no longer persuade her otherwise. When she took the stand, Roland carefully avoided repeating claims he knew were disproved. But under questioning about our marriage, Tamara returned to the same theme herself. Nathaniel lived comfortably because I worked constantly, she said. That is what our marriage became. Victor began the reversal with the smallest issue, Caldwell Drive. He handed the clerk the authenticated title record, purchase agreement, prenuptial schedule, and tracing report already admitted into evidence. Mrs. Hayes, he said, the property was acquired by Hayes Residential Holdings, wholly owned by the Hayes Legacy Trust, 3 years before you met your husband. Correct? Tamara looked toward Roland. That is what the document says, she replied. Victor continued. And your counsel advised you, before mediation, that the acquisition predated the marriage? She paused. He told me Nathaniel had documents. You tore one of those documents in half without reading it, correct? Yes. Victor then walked her through the household ledger. Every mortgage-related payment from a joint account had been matched by reimbursement from the trust-owned property company. Some marital funds had passed through the administrative account temporarily, but none remained invested in the property. Judge Holloway ruled that Caldwell Drive remained separate premarital property under the prenuptial agreement and Illinois tracing rules. Then Victor moved to me. Harrison Crest's ownership documents were authenticated through our outside auditor, trustee records, shareholder register, and testimony from an independent board member. He did not announce my net worth like a showman. He established the structure one document at a time. Harrison Crest was a private investment group. The Hayes Legacy Trust held the controlling interest for my benefit. I retained voting control subject to board governance. My ownership had existed years before my marriage. When Victor finished, Judge Holloway looked across the courtroom at Tamara. She had stopped taking notes. Victor asked me, Mr. Hayes, is Harrison Crest Capital Group the principal source of your professional income and investment wealth? Yes, I replied. Have you concealed that ownership from tax authorities, regulators, your banks, auditors, or this court? No, I said. I kept it private from publicity. That is not the same as keeping it undocumented. Victor then entered the most recent audited valuation. My personal net worth exceeded $10 billion. Tamara stared at me. The expression on her face was not admiration. Not yet. It was disorientation. You own Harrison Crest? She asked before Roland could stop her. Judge Holloway reminded her to wait for questioning. Victor did not turn the moment into theater. He moved directly to the next set of records. Harrison Crest Investments in Riverton. 19 transactions over 6 years. Approximately $1.4 billion in total capital. Board approvals. Independent Investment Committee minutes. My conflict disclosures. My recusals. Every document showed that the transactions had been evaluated professionally rather than given as favors. Mr. Hayes did not personally direct ordinary Riverton investments, Victor said. He did, however, control the institution that repeatedly supplied substantial capital while maintaining formal governance safeguards. Tamara looked down at the transaction schedule. She recognized the dates. I could see it happening. Those were not abstract numbers to her. They were years of emergencies she remembered surviving. Victor saved the Harrove acquisition for last. He handed Tamara the closing timeline and asked whether she remembered the week Riverton's primary lender withdrew. Of course, she said. Her voice was quieter. That deal changed my career. Victor showed her the board memorandum stating that failure to replace the missing commitment would likely terminate the acquisition and trigger substantial losses. Then he produced Harrison Crest's $185 million bridge authorization. My signature appeared beneath a conflict disclosure stating that I was Tamara Hayes' husband and would take no part in subsequent negotiations. Tamara read the page twice. "You signed this?" she asked me. "Yes," I replied. "That financing saved Harrove," she said. "It allowed it to close," I answered. "Your team still had to complete the acquisition." She looked at me as if she was remembering the champagne in our kitchen. "Why did you never tell me?" she asked. "Because you had worked for that victory," I said. "I wanted you to feel it belonged to you. I did not need my name attached to it." For the first time that day, Tamara's composure truly failed. Tears filled her eyes, but she did not cry loudly. She looked down at the authorization again. Harrove had earned her promotion. She had referenced it in interviews, speeches, and executive profiles as proof that she could rescue a complicated deal under pressure. Years later, she had used that same success as evidence that she had outgrown me. "You knew what it meant to me," she said. "Yes. And you never wanted credit?" "Not from the public," I replied. "I wanted a wife who respected me without requiring a resume first." The courtroom stayed completely quiet. Victor allowed several seconds to pass before asking one final question. "Mrs. Hayes, when your husband tried to hand you the trust and property explanation in your office lobby, what did you do?" Tamara swallowed. "I tore it up. And when he warned you about suspicious Riverton transfers?" "I ignored him." "Did Warren Vale physically force you to do either thing?" "No," she whispered. Victor then turned to the evidence against me. Bryce Marsh testified after the court returned from a recess requested for authentication issues. He explained how he had been hired through an intermediary controlled by Warren's associates to create transaction models. He identified the original instructions, the modified files, and the altered records later submitted in support of Tamara's asset concealment theory. His preserved source files showed where dates, account identifiers, and destinations have been changed to make legitimate domestic transfers appear to terminate at offshore entities. He produced messages discussing how those records could force Harrison Crest to disclose lender and portfolio information. He also produced payment instructions connecting the intermediary to the same consulting entities used in Warren's Riverton diversion scheme. When Victor asked why Bryce had contacted him anonymously, Bryce replied, "Because I realized the files were not being used as models. They were being used to accuse a real person of moving money he never moved." Warren remained seated in the gallery, expressionless. Bryce also authenticated messages concerning the stolen forensic drive. He had not witnessed the theft, so Victor never asked him to pretend he had. Instead, Bryce identified a message from Warren's operations consultant stating, "The courier recovered the image from Cross's secondary office. Original will be destroyed." Security records later connected the courier to compromised contractor credentials. The theft, witness intimidation, fabricated records, and interstate fund transfers had already been under federal investigation for weeks. Bryce's testimony did not magically create an arrest warrant in the courtroom. Federal agents had obtained a sealed warrant the previous evening based on evidence gathered independently from banks, witnesses, servers, and communications. After Bryce finished testifying, Judge Holloway recessed. The family case so attorneys could address the implications of fabricated evidence. Warren left the courtroom under instruction from his attorney. Federal agents arrested him in the secured hallway minutes later. Nobody announced charges theatrically. We learned afterward that the warrant included allegations of wire fraud, obstruction, evidence tampering, and witness intimidation. Tamara sat across from me during the recess, looking as if every assumption she had brought into the building had collapsed in the wrong order. First, the house she claimed to have purchased had never been hers. Then the husband she called financially dependent turned out to control Harrison Crest. Then she learned my company had invested $1.4 billion into hers. Then came Harrove, the accomplishment she was proudest of, and my signature beneath the financing that kept it alive. Finally, she watched Warren's manufacture case begin falling apart in authenticated records. "You tried to warn me," she said quietly when our attorneys were several feet away. "Twice," I replied. She looked at her hands. "I thought you were trying to frighten me because you were losing. You thought that because Warren told you to." She nodded. "Partly." I held her gaze. Partly is the important word. She closed her eyes. She finally understood that manipulation explained Warren's behavior. It did not erase hers. Judge Holloway did not finish every consequence that afternoon. The fabricated evidence revelation required additional briefing, authentication, and a later hearing. Over the following weeks, the court confirmed Caldwell Drive as separate property, traced the disputed accounts individually, and divided only the assets that legally belonged in the marital estate. Some joint savings were marital, and I did not contest Tamara receiving her lawful share. Other accounts were traceable to premarital trust property and remained separate. Her request for maintenance was denied primarily because she had substantial independent earnings and assets even after losing the disputed claims. The temporary restrictions on my accounts were lifted once the tracing review ended. I instructed Victor not to fight over property Tamara had legitimately earned. "I do not want punishment disguised as litigation," I told him. "If it is legally hers, let her have it." I was not interested in using wealth to make her life unnecessarily difficult. I only refused to give away assets she had attempted to claim through allegations that were not true. Tamara also faced consequences separate from Warren's crimes. Illinois prosecutors reviewed the sworn declarations and supporting statements she had signed after her attorney warned her that several claims were unverified or contradicted by produced records. Her cooperation with the wider investigation mattered, as did the fact that she had not created Warren's fabricated banking evidence. Ultimately, she entered a deferred prosecution arrangement involving a substantial financial penalty, court supervision, required cooperation, and restrictions connected to the ongoing investigation. Warren's case went much further. Months later, federal prosecutors indicted him and several associates. He eventually pleaded guilty to wire fraud and obstruction-related offenses tied to the diverted Riverton funds, fabricated litigation evidence, and interference with witnesses. He received a federal prison sentence and restitution obligations. I had no role in negotiating that outcome. Investigators, prosecutors, bank records, digital evidence, witnesses, and Warren's own communications built the case. That mattered to me. I wanted the truth established through institutions designed to establish it, not through my personal power. Riverton's board placed Tamara on leave almost immediately. The decision was not punishment for divorcing me or failing to know who I was. The board was examining her undisclosed emotional and romantic relationship with Warren, her decision to involve him in litigation affecting a major investor, her approval of public allegations that had not been verified, her failure to escalate warnings about suspicious transfers, and several corporate decisions she made while Warren's influence over her was concealed. Internal messages made clear that their relationship had crossed professional boundaries before she filed for divorce. There were private dinners, hotel meetings, romantic messages, and discussions about traveling together after our marriage ended. 3 weeks later, the board removed her from her executive role. Harrison Crest did not demand it. I did not call the board or threaten the company. I recused myself from our own internal discussions concerning Riverton. Tamara lost the position because her judgment had become compromised in ways that directly affected the company she had worked so hard to lead. The divorce became final 4 months after the first trial hearing. Tamara kept her personal savings, retirement assets, her lawful portion of marital investments, and property she had purchased with her own earnings. I kept Caldwell Drive, my premarital trust assets, Harrison Crest, and accounts properly traced to those sources. There was no reconciliation clause hidden inside the settlement, no dramatic final demand, and no attempt for me to take more simply because I could. On the afternoon the final decree was entered, Tamara asked whether she could speak to me privately in a conference room near the courthouse. Victor waited outside. Tamara looked tired in a way I had never seen during our marriage. "I know saying Warren manipulated me sounds like an excuse," she said. "He kept telling me you were hiding money because you were ashamed you had nothing. Every time you warned me, he gave me an explanation that made you look desperate. I believe he manipulated you," I replied. "That does not mean every decision belonged to him." Tamara looked down. "I was angry," she said. "I had spent years thinking I was carrying us." "Roland told you the financial statements were not verified," I replied. "You went on television anyway. I put a document in your hand. You tore it up without opening it. I warned you about Warren's transfers. You forwarded the warning to him. You told reporters I contributed nothing. You told Warren privately that I was comfortable being small. He encouraged all of it, but he did not invent your contempt." Her eyes filled again. "I am ashamed of those messages." "I believe you," I said, "but there is something else you need to understand. Your attitude toward me changed after you learned what I owned. You did not suddenly discover that I had been patient with you, supported you, listened to you, or helped you when your work became difficult. You already knew those things. What changed was that you discovered they came from a powerful man instead of the unimpressive husband you thought you had." She wiped her cheek. "That is not fair. It is exactly why I cannot come back," I replied. "If the court had proven I earned $40,000 a year instead of controlling Harrison Crest, would you be sitting here asking for another chance?" Tamara did not answer. I did not need her to. "You are sorry," I continued. "I believe your regret is real. But being sorry because the person you humiliated turned out to be important is different from being sorry because you humiliated someone you loved. I needed respect when you thought I had nothing impressive to offer you. That was when it would have meant something." She whispered, "I did love you." "I know," I said. "I loved you too. That is why this hurts. But love that survives only while admiration is attached to status is not enough to rebuild a marriage." I stood, wished her well, and left the room before either of us could turn grief into another negotiation. A year later, the Hayes Foundation opened its first legal support and whistleblower assistance center in Chicago. The foundation funded representation for people dealing with financial fraud and provided relocation assistance, private security support, counseling referrals, and anti-retaliation resources for employees who reported corporate misconduct. It was not government witness protection, and we never described it that way. Bryce's experience had shown me how exposed ordinary employees could become when they challenged powerful organizations. My mother spoke at the opening. Evelyn ignored the introduction I had prepared and told the audience about teaching teenagers for 31 years. "Young people," she said, "can tell very quickly when an adult is pretending to be more important than everyone else. It keeps you humble." The room laughed. I stood near the back and laughed with them. For months after the trial, strangers recognized my name more often than I wanted. Harrison Crest's ownership was no longer private in the way it had been before. I adjusted. Privacy had mattered to me, but preserving a secret had never mattered more than preserving the truth. A reporter stopped me outside after the foundation opening and asked why I had not publicly revealed my wealth the moment Tamara first described me as financially dependent. I thought about Harrove, the torn document, the messages between Tamara and Warren, and the expression on her face when she finally understood who had signed the financing authorization years earlier. Because the amount of money I had was never the part of her accusation that hurt, I said. What hurt was learning that she believed a husband who earned less than she did deserved less respect. Finding out that I was wealthy changed how she saw me. It did not change who I had been while we were married. The reporter lowered her recorder slightly. I looked back through the glass doors where my mother was talking with Bryce and several young attorneys. Tamara did not lose me because she failed to discover I was rich. She lost me because when she believed I was ordinary, she decided ordinary meant worthless. I walked down the steps and never looked back. If you enjoyed this story, please like, comment, and share this video with your friends. Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss a powerful story drop.